The winter of 1887 descended upon the Colorado high country with a vengeance that old-timers would speak of for decades to come. Snow began falling on the second day of December and did not stop for nearly 3 weeks, burying homesteads, killing livestock, and driving even the hardiest souls to question why they had ever ventured west of the Mississippi. In the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where the wind howled through canyons like the screams of forgotten ghosts, a small cabin clung to the side of a ridge as if by sheer stubbornness alone. The man who lived there had built it with his own hands 5 years prior, cutting each log from the forest that surrounded him, fitting each stone of the fireplace with the precision of someone who understood that in this country, craftsmanship was the difference between survival and a frozen grave. Caleb Stone stood at his window watching the snow pile higher against the fence posts he had set that autumn. The glass was thick with frost and his breath fogged against it as he pressed closer, trying to make out the shapes of his horse in the stable across the yard. They were restless tonight, and he could hear their whinnies cutting through the howl of the wind. Horses knew things that men did not. They sensed changes in the weather, the approach of predators, the shifting of the world in ways that human senses could not perceive. Caleb had learned to trust their instincts over his own, and their agitation now set his nerves on edge. He turned away from the window and surveyed the cabin that had been his home for half a decade. It was not large, just a single room with a bed in one corner, a table, and 2 chairs in another, and the stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. But it was solid, built to withstand the brutal winters that swept down from the peaks, and it was his. The only thing in the world that still belonged to Caleb Stone besides his horses and his rifle and the memories he could not escape, no matter how far he ran. There was a time when he had owned much more. A house in Kansas City with white columns and a wraparound porch. A wife named Eleanor who laughed like music and smelled of lavender and made him believe that life was good. A son named Tomo who had just learned to walk, who called him Papa, in a voice that made Caleb's heart swell with pride. That life seemed to belong to someone else now, a stranger whose memories occasionally surfaced like debris from a shipwreck, painful and distant and impossible to grasp. The cholera outbreak of 1882 had taken everything from him in the span of 11 days. Eleanor had been the first to fall ill, complaining of stomach pains one morning and burning with fever by nightfall. Caleb had held her through the worst of it, watching helplessly as the disease ravaged her body as she grew weaker and more delirious with each passing hour. She had died on the 7th day, whispering his name with her final breath, and Caleb had barely had time to mourn before Thomas began showing symptoms. His boy had fought harder than Eleanor. 3 years old and already stubborn, already strong, already so much like his father that it hurt to look at him. Thomas had held on for 4 days, his little body racked with fever and pain, his eyes fixed on Caleb's face, as if his father could somehow save him. But Caleb could not save him. No one could. When the end came, Caleb had been holding his son in his arms, singing the lullaby that Eleanor had always sung, and he had felt the moment when Thomas's spirit slipped away, leaving behind only a shell that looked like a sleeping child. He had buried them both in the cemetery behind the church, their graves side by side under a maple tree that turned red every autumn. He had stood there for hours after the service, long after the mourners had gone, staring at the fresh earth and wondering why he was still alive when everyone he loved was gone. The question had haunted him for weeks, months, years. It haunted him still on nights like this, when the wind screamed and the snow fell, and there was no one to talk to but the ghosts of his past. After the funeral, Caleb had sold the house, the furniture, every reminder of the life he had built. The money went into a horse, a rifle, supplies, and a one-way journey into the wilderness where no one knew his name and no one would ask about the grief that lived behind his eyes. He had ridden west until he found these mountains, and he had stopped only because his horse could go no further. That first winter had nearly killed him. He had been unprepared, foolish, driven more by a death wish than any real survival instinct. But somehow he had made it through, and when spring came, he had found himself still breathing, still existing, still unable to die, no matter how little he cared about living. So he had built the cabin. He had started raising horses for the army posts that dotted the territory. He had taught himself to trap and hunt, to preserve meat and tan hides, to exist in solitude so complete that weeks would pass without him speaking a single word aloud. It was not a life exactly. It was more like a long, slow waiting for an end that never came. But it was something, and sometimes something was all a man had. The storm arrived with unprecedented fury on the third night of December. Caleb had seen bad weather before, but this was something else entirely. The wind came from the north with a shriek that sounded almost human, driving snow so thick that he could not see the stable from his window. The temperature dropped until the logs of his cabin cracked from the cold, and the fire in his hearth seemed to shrink against the assault of the weather outside. He had prepared well. His woodpile was deep, his stores were full, and he could wait out almost anything. But as he sat by the fire, working a piece of leather into a new bridle, he could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was past midnight when the sound cut through the howling wind. At first, Caleb thought it was the horses again, their whinnies carried on the storm. But the sound came again, and he recognized it for what it was. Someone was at his gate, and they were calling for help. He pulled on his heavy coat and grabbed the lantern from its hook by the door. The cold hit him like a physical blow the moment he stepped outside, stealing his breath and burning his exposed skin. Snow drove into his face, and he had to shield his eyes with his hand just to see where he was going. The path to the gate was buried under drifts, and he struggled through snow that reached nearly to his waist, each step an effort that cost him precious warmth. Through the driving snow, he could see a shape at the fence line, a figure too tall to be a child, but moving with the desperate weakness of someone at the very end of their strength. Caleb raised the lantern higher, and the flame guttered in the wind, threatening to go out entirely. But in its flickering light, he saw her clearly, and what he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. She was the largest woman he had ever seen, standing nearly 6 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as most men, and arms that showed corded muscle, even beneath the torn remnants of a coat. Her feet were bare, the skin blackened with frostbite, and her long black hair whipped around her face in the wind like a living thing. She was covered in wounds, some fresh and bleeding, others older and crusted with dried blood. Her clothing was torn, barely adequate for a mild autumn day, let alone a winter storm that would have killed most people hours ago. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Even in the storm, even through the pain that must have been screaming through every nerve in her body, those eyes held a defiance that he recognized. It was the look of someone who had been broken by the world and had chosen to keep standing anyway. Her lips moved cracked and bleeding from the cold, and her voice was barely audible above the wind. She needed a place just for one night. She would do anything to serve him. The words carried the weight of desperation of a person who had been forced to make that offer before and expected it to be accepted in the worst possible way. Caleb felt something twist in his chest. He knew that look. He had seen it in his own reflection during those dark days in Kansas City when he had considered whether there was any point in continuing to breathe. He unlocked the gate and pulled it open, the hinges screaming in protest against the ice that had formed on them. Another hour out in this storm, and she would be dead, he told her. She needed to come inside. The woman stood motionless for a moment, as if she could not quite believe what was happening. Then she stepped through the gate, each movement heavy and deliberate, like someone who had walked for days and had finally reached the limits of even her remarkable endurance. Caleb led her across the yard, fighting through the snow, acutely aware of her presence behind him. She moved silently despite her size, and when he glanced back, he saw that she was watching him with the wary intensity of a wild animal. She did not trust him. She was simply too desperate to have any other choice. He understood that, and he respected it. Trust had to be earned, especially for someone who had clearly been given every reason to distrust the world. Inside the cabin, the warmth hit them both like a wave. Caleb shut the door against the screaming wind and stood for a moment, catching his breath. The woman stood near the door, dripping melted snow onto his floor, every muscle tense and ready for fight or flight. The fireplace cast dancing shadows across the walls, and in that light, Caleb could see the full extent of her injuries. Bruises covered her arms and shoulders, deep purple against her copper skin. Long scars, some old and some terrifyingly fresh, crisscrossed her back where her torn coat hung open. This was not the work of the wilderness. These wounds had been inflicted by human hands. He set the lantern down on the table and kept his movements slow and deliberate, the way he would approach a spooked horse. He asked her to come sit closer to the fire to get warm. She hesitated, her dark eyes studying him with an intensity that felt like it could bore through stone. He could almost see her calculating the risks, weighing the danger of staying against the certainty of death if she returned to the storm. After what felt like an eternity, she crossed to the fireplace and lowered herself to the floor, her large bony hands reaching out toward the heat. She did not make a sound, but Caleb could see the pain in every breath she took, the way her body shuddered as warmth began to seep back into her frozen flesh. He ladled soup from the pot that hung over the fire and brought it to her in a wooden bowl. She looked at the bowl, then up at him, and her voice was low and cautious when she spoke. She wanted to know if he was afraid of her. White men usually were. Caleb considered the question as he settled into a chair across from her. He answered simply that he did not see anything to fear. He saw someone about to freeze to death, and that was all. The answer seemed to surprise her. For a moment, something flickered behind her eyes, something that might have been hope or might have been disbelief. Then she lowered her head and began to eat each spoonful, seeming to take all the strength she had left. Caleb added more logs to the fire, the crackling sound filling the room like the cabin's familiar whisper. He did not stare at her, did not press her with questions, did not do anything that might make her feel cornered. He simply sat in his chair and worked on his bridle, giving her the space she clearly needed. When she finished eating, she set the bowl down and pulled the blanket he had given her over her bruised legs. A long while passed before she finally spoke again, her eyes fixed on the flames rather than on him. She told him she would leave in the morning. She did not want to cause any trouble. Caleb glanced at the frost-covered window. Outside was nothing but thick white, and the wind shook the door on its hinges with every gust. He asked her where she would go. She said nothing. He told her the snow was knee-deep and going out there now would be suicide. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and even someone as strong as her would not survive another night in the open. She could stay until the weather broke. It was not kindness, exactly. It was simply practical. There was no sense in saving someone's life only to let them walk out into certain death the next morning. She looked up at him then, and some of the suspicion in her eyes faded, though the wariness remained. She wanted to know what he expected from her if she stayed. The question carried weight layers of meaning that spoke of experiences he did not want to imagine. Caleb leaned against the wall and crossed his arms. He expected nothing, he told her. She could stay until the storm passed, and then she could go wherever she pleased. He did not need payment. He did not need service. He just needed her to not die on his doorstep. She stared at him for a long time, her dark eyes searching his face for the hidden catch, the ulterior motive that her experience had taught her to expect. But Caleb did not look away. He simply reached over and handed her another blanket, then returned to his work on the bridle. At last, she lay down by the fire, her breathing slowly evening out as exhaustion claimed her. She curled up like a child despite her formidable size, and in sleep, the hardness left her face, revealing a vulnerability she would never have shown while awake. Caleb sat at the table whittling wood to pass the time, occasionally glancing at the stranger who had crashed into his carefully constructed solitude. Outside, the white storm still screamed, but inside his cabin something had changed. The silence that had surrounded him for 5 years was no longer empty. There was another breath in the room, another heartbeat, another life. He did not know what it meant. He did not know if it meant anything at all. But as he watched her sleep, he felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time, something that might have been hope. He had learned her name before she slept, Kaya Blackwater. She had offered it reluctantly, as if giving her name was giving away a piece of herself that she could not afford to lose. The name rolled off her tongue like a song, in a language he did not speak, and he filed it away in his memory, alongside the questions he was too polite to ask. In return, he told her his own name, Caleb Stone. She had nodded once, her eyes already growing heavy, and within minutes her breathing had deepened into the sleep of the truly exhausted. He wondered when she had last slept without fear. Judging by the tension that remained in her body even in slumber, the answer was probably never. The fire burned low as the night wore on, and Caleb kept vigil, adding logs when necessary, and watching the woman who had upended his entire existence without saying more than a dozen words. He thought about Eleanor, about how she used to say that God put people in your path for a reason, even when that reason was not immediately clear. He had stopped believing in God the day he buried his son, but sitting here now, watching this wounded stranger sleep by his fire, he wondered if perhaps something larger than coincidence had brought her to his gate. The storm raged for 3 more days, trapping them together in the small cabin. Caleb quickly learned to read the rhythms of this woman who had invaded his solitary existence. He learned that she rose before the sun, her body trained by years of hardship to wake at the first hint of light. He learned that she could not bear to be in a room with the door locked, that even the suggestion of confinement made her breathing quicken and her eyes go wild. He learned that she flinched at sudden movements, but never backed away from hard work, that she ate quickly and hunched over her food as if expecting someone to take it from her. On the second day, when the storm showed no sign of relenting, Kaya rose from her place by the fire and surveyed the cabin with assessing eyes. She asked if there was work she could do. The question was not really a question. It was a demand, a declaration that she would not accept charity without giving something in return. Caleb could see the pride behind the request, the determination not to be indebted to anyone, and he respected it even as he wished she would simply rest and heal. He told her the cabin needed firewood and the path to the woodshed needed clearing. Before he could say anything else, she was on her feet and heading for the door. He tried to stop her, pointing out that she was still injured, that her feet were barely healed from the frostbite, that the cold would only set back her recovery. She looked at him with something that might have been amusement or might have been contempt. She told him she had survived worse than cold. He followed her outside, partly to help and partly to make sure she did not collapse in the snow. What he witnessed made him revise every assumption he had made about human strength. Kaya waded through drifts that reached her waist as if they were nothing more than tall grass. She lifted logs that would have taken Caleb a full minute to drag, hoisting them onto her shoulder with casual ease. When a particularly stubborn tree limb blocked the path, she grasped it with both hands and wrenched it free from the frozen ground, her muscles straining against the fabric of the shirt he had lent her. He asked if she had always been this strong. She shrugged and something flickered behind her eyes. To survive in her tribe, you had to be strong. The answer was simple, but Caleb heard the pain beneath it. Whatever strength she possessed had been bought at a price he could only imagine. That entire day they worked side by side in the howling wind. They cleared paths through the snow, reinforced the stable where his horses stamped nervously, chopped enough wood to last another week. Kaya did the work of 3 people without complaint, her movements efficient and practiced to her body seemingly immune to the cold that made Caleb's bones ache. But she never boasted, never drew attention to her abilities. She simply worked, and Caleb found himself oddly grateful for her presence. When evening came and they returned to the cabin, exhausted and half frozen, something had shifted between them. They were no longer stranger and reluctant host. They were something closer to partners, 2 people working together against the indifferent cruelty of nature. Caleb made dinner while Kaya sat by the fire, flexing her frostbitten toes and watching him with curious eyes. He could feel her gaze on his back as he moved around the small space, and he found that he did not mind. For the first time in 5 years, he was not alone, and the realization was both terrifying and strangely comforting. As they ate in silence, Caleb studied Kaya across the flickering firelight. The bruises on her face were beginning to yellow, the first stage of healing, and the cuts on her arms had scabbed over. But there were scars beneath the fresh wounds, old injuries that spoke of years of abuse. Whoever had hurt her, they had been doing it for a long time. The thought made something dark and angry stir in Caleb's chest, a protective instinct he had not felt since Eleanor and Thomas were alive. Kaya caught him staring and raised an eyebrow. He quickly looked away, embarrassed to be caught. But a moment later, she spoke, her voice low and even. She told him he could ask. Everyone always wanted to ask about the scars. She was used to it. Caleb shook his head. He told her that her scars were her own business. If she wanted to talk about them, she would. If not, he would not pry. Either way, it did not change anything. She was welcome here until the storm passed, no questions asked. The answer seemed to catch her off guard. She looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes unreadable, and then she did something he had not expected. She smiled. It was just the barest twitch of her lips, gone, almost before it appeared, but it transformed her entire face. For just a moment, she looked almost young, almost hopeful, almost like someone who had not been broken by the world. The moment passed, and she turned back to the fire. But something had changed between them. Some invisible barrier had been lowered. They sat in comfortable silence as the storm raged outside, and for the first time since she had arrived, Kaya did not look like she was expecting attack at any moment. That night, before sleep claimed her, she said something that made Caleb's heart ache. She told him that he was the first person in a long time who had not looked at her with fear or hunger. She did not know what to make of it. Caleb lay awake long after her breathing had deepened into sleep, staring at the ceiling and wondering what kind of life would make simple decency seem like such a novelty. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, but by then neither of them was in any hurry for Kaya to leave. The sun emerged from behind the clouds, brilliant and blinding against the fresh snow, and the world transformed into a glittering landscape of white and blue. Caleb opened the door and stood on the threshold, breathing in air that no longer tried to kill him, and felt something like gratitude for the simple fact of survival. Kaya came to stand beside him, her shoulder almost touching his, and they surveyed the frozen world together. The snow was deep, far too deep for travel, and it would be days before the paths were clear enough for a horse. Caleb pointed this out not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. Kaya nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains. She said she supposed she was not leaving yet. He handed her a cup of hot coffee, a luxury he reserved for special occasions. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup and sipped slowly, and something in her posture relaxed. Caleb realized that she had been preparing herself to leave, steeling herself for another journey into the unknown, and the reprieve had caught her off guard. He wondered how long it had been since anyone had given her permission to simply stay. They fell into a routine over the following days, a pattern of coexistence that felt surprisingly natural. Mornings began before dawn, with Kaya building up the fire while Caleb made coffee and breakfast. They ate together in comfortable silence, planning the day's work over simple meals of bread and dried meat. Then they would venture out into the cold, working side by side until the light faded. Evenings were spent by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply sitting in the companionable quiet of two people who had nothing to prove to each other. Kaya's strength continued to amaze him. She could lift things that should have been impossible, could work for hours without rest, could endure cold and pain that would have crippled most men. But her strength was not just physical. It was in the way she refused to be diminished, the way she held her head high, despite everything she had clearly suffered, the way she met his eyes without flinching, even though he could see the weariness that never quite left her. On the fifth evening, as they sat by the fire after a particularly exhausting day of clearing snow from the stable roof, Caleb found himself asking the question he had promised not to ask. He wanted to know where she had come from, how she had ended up at his gate in the middle of the worst storm in living memory. Kaya was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat and distant, as if she were reciting facts about someone else. She had been born into the Chiricahua Apache, she said, in the territory that the white men now called Arizona. Her mother had died giving birth to her, and her father had raised her alone, teaching her to hunt and ride and fight like a warrior. When she grew to be taller and stronger than any of the boys her age, her father had been proud. He had seen her abilities as gifts, as signs that she was meant for something extraordinary. But the elders had not been pleased. A woman who could outfight men was an abomination, they said, a disruption to the natural order. They had tolerated her as long as her father lived, partly out of respect for him and partly out of fear of what she might do if provoked. But when he died of fever when she was 15, Kaya had been left without protection. She paused, her hands tightening on the cup she held. Caleb waited, not pushing, giving her the space to continue or stop as she chose. After a moment, she went on. The tribe had tolerated her because of her usefulness. She could do the work of 3 women and fight like a warrior when raids came. But she was never accepted. The other women feared her and refused to include her in their circles. The men either resented her or wanted to possess her, as if her strength was a challenge they needed to conquer. She had lived on the edges of her own community, always watching, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then when she was 22, the chief's brother had decided that she would be his concubine. Kaya's voice hardened as she spoke his name. Grey Wolf, he was a man who took what he wanted and destroyed what he could not have. He already had 3 wives, all of them cowed into submission by his cruelty. When he announced his intention to make Kaya his 4th, she had done something that no woman in the tribe had ever done. She had said no. The punishment had been swift and brutal. Grey Wolf had ordered her beaten by his warriors, and when that had not broken her spirit, he had dragged her before the tribal council and accused her of treason. The elders, many of whom owed their positions to Grey Wolf's influence, had sided with him. Kaya was cast out, stripped of her belongings, driven from the only home she had ever known. But that had not been enough for Grey Wolf. As she was being forced out of the camp, he had caught her alone and inflicted wounds that went beyond mere punishment. He had wanted to mark her, to ensure that wherever she went, she would carry the evidence of his power. The scars on her back, the ones Caleb had glimpsed on that first night, were his work. Kaya fell silent, her eyes still fixed on the fire. The flames cast shadows across her face, deepening the lines of pain and exhaustion that marked her features. Caleb sat motionless, his hands clenched into fists, a cold rage burning in his chest. He wanted to find this gray wolf and put a bullet between his eyes. He wanted to make him suffer the way he had made Kaya suffer. But more than that, he wanted to take away the pain that lived behind her careful mask. He told her that no one had the right to do that to her. No one. His voice came out rough, almost angry, and Kaya looked up at him in surprise. She was not used to anger on her behalf. She was used to being blamed for her own suffering, told that she had brought it on herself by being too strong, too defiant, too different. Caleb held her gaze. He told her that he had known cruel men in his life, men who took pleasure in causing pain. They were cowards, every one of them. They only preyed on those they thought weaker than themselves, and they crumbled when faced with anyone who could fight back. Grey Wolf was no different. He was a bully who had hurt her because he could not, because she deserved it. Kaya stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her eyes. The wariness was still there, but beneath it he could see something else. Gratitude. Relief. The beginning of trust. She told him that she had tested him from the first night. The question about whether he was afraid of her, the offer to serve him in any way, it had all been a test. She needed to know if he was like the others, like the men who saw her only as something to be used or conquered. The men she had met since her exile, the ones who had offered her shelter and food, had all wanted something in return. They had expected her body, her submission, her degradation. When she refused, they had tried to take what she would not give. She had fought them off every time. She had killed two of them when they would not stop. But each encounter had left her more exhausted, more wounded, more convinced that there was no place in the world where she could be safe. And then she had found his cabin in the storm, and she had made her offer one more time, expecting the same result. But Caleb had surprised her. He had taken her in without conditions, had treated her with a respect she had almost forgotten existed. She still did not quite believe it was real. Caleb understood. He told her that if she needed to hear it again, the answer would always be the same. He was not that kind of man. He would never be that kind of man. What happened to her mattered to him, not because he wanted something from her, but because she was a human being who deserved to be treated with dignity. Kaya took a deep breath, and for the first time, she let the hurt show openly on her face. The mask she had worn so carefully began to crack, revealing the scared, exhausted woman beneath the warrior's facade. She told him that it had been a long time since she had felt safe. She had almost forgotten what it was like. The fireplace crackled, and in the silence that followed, something changed between them. The invisible barriers that had separated them, the walls they had both built around their wounded hearts, began to come down. They were no longer just two strangers sharing shelter. They were two souls who had recognized something in each other, some capacity for healing that neither had believed still existed. That night, Kaya did not sleep on the floor by the fire. She sat beside Caleb at the table, and they talked until the flames burned low, sharing stories and silences in equal measure. She told him about her father, about the songs he had sung to her as a child, about the hunting trips where he had taught her everything he knew. He told her about Eleanor and Thomas, about the life he had lost, and the years he had spent running from grief. They spoke of pain and loss and the stubborn refusal to give up, and in the sharing they found something they had both thought lost forever. Connection. Understanding. The beginning of trust. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they slept on opposite sides of the room, but the space between them felt smaller than it had before. And in the darkness just before sleep took her, Kaya whispered something that Caleb almost did not catch. She told him thank you, not just for saving her life, but for seeing her as human. Caleb stared at the ceiling, his heart heavy with anger at the people who had hurt her, and something warmer that he was not yet ready to name. He told her that she was the most human person he had ever met, and in the quiet of that winter night, with the storm finally dying outside, both of them began to believe that perhaps they had stumbled onto something worth holding on to. The days that followed were the strangest of Caleb's life. He had spent 5 years alone, his only companions, the horses and the ghosts of his past. Now there was another person in his space, another voice in the silence, another presence that he had to account for in everything he did. It should have been awkward, uncomfortable an intrusion into the solitary existence he had carefully constructed. Instead, it felt strangely natural, like a piece of himself that had been missing had finally been returned. Kaya threw herself into the work of the homestead with a fierce energy that seemed designed to prove her worth. She repaired fences that had been neglected for years. She cleared paths through the forest that made checking the trap lines faster and easier. She worked with the horses, and to Caleb's amazement, even the most skittish animals responded to her as if she were one of their own. He watched her standing in the stable, her hand resting on the neck of his most difficult mare, speaking to the animal in low melodic tones, and felt something shift in his chest. He asked her about it one evening as they sat by the fire after another long day of work. How was it that the horses trusted her so completely? Kaya shrugged, her eyes distant. Animals could sense things that humans could not, she told him. They knew when someone meant them harm and when someone was safe. She had always been good with animals because they did not judge her for being different. They did not care that she was stronger than a woman should be, or that she refused to behave the way women were supposed to behave. They simply saw her for what she was, and they accepted her. The answer made Caleb sad, though he tried not to show it. He thought about how lonely her life must have been, finding more acceptance among animals than among her own people. He thought about the years she had spent on the margins, never quite belonging, never quite safe. And he made a silent promise to himself that as long as she was here, she would never feel that way again. The snow began to melt in late February, the first signs of spring appearing in the high country. Patches of brown earth emerged from beneath the white, and the streams began to flow again after months of ice. The world was waking up, and with it came a question that had been hovering between them for weeks. What happened now? Keisha was healed, the paths were clear, and there was nothing keeping her here except her own choice. On a crisp morning when the sun was bright and the air smelled of thaw, Caleb found Kaya standing on the porch staring out at the mountains. Her expression was unreadable, but there was tension in her shoulders that had not been there for weeks. He came to stand beside her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Finally, Kaya broke the silence. She told him that the snow was melting. The passes would be open soon. She could leave if he wanted her to. The words were careful, neutral, but Caleb could hear the question beneath them. She was giving him an out, a chance to reclaim his solitary life without any awkwardness. But she was also asking, in the only way she knew how, whether he wanted her to stay. Caleb did not answer right away. He thought about the 5 years he had spent alone, the empty silence that had been his only companion, the slow fade of existence without purpose or connection. He thought about the past 2 months, about working beside her, about talking with her by the fire, about the way his cabin had started to feel like a home again instead of just a shelter. He told her that he did not want her to leave, not because she owed him anything and not because she had nowhere else to go, but because his life was better with her in it, because the silence was not so heavy when she was there to share it, because he had started to remember what it felt like to not be alone. Kaya turned to look at him, and her dark eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. She told him that she had spent her whole life being told she did not belong. Too strong to be a proper woman, too wild to be accepted by her tribe, too Indian to be accepted by white society. For the first time in her life, she was in a place where she might actually fit. She did not want to lose that. Caleb reached out and took her hand. It was the first time they had touched, really touched, since that first night when he had helped her through the gate. Her hand was rough and calloused, the hand of someone who had worked hard their entire life, but it was warm and it fit perfectly in his. He told her that she would not have to lose it. This was her home now, if she wanted it to be. Kaya looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. Something in her expression shifted the last of her walls coming down, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. She told him that she wanted it. She wanted to stay. They stood together on the porch, hands intertwined, watching the sun rise over the mountains. The future was uncertain, the danger was not past, and there would be challenges ahead that neither of them could foresee. But in that moment, none of it mattered. They had found each other, two broken souls, who had somehow become whole together, and that was enough. For the first time in 5 years, Caleb Stone felt something that he had thought lost forever. Hope. And beside him, Kaya Blackwater felt something she had never truly felt before. Home. 3 weeks into Kaya's decision to stay, the first sign of trouble appeared. Caleb had ridden down to the trading post at the foot of the mountain to resupply, leaving Kaya at the cabin with instructions to stay out of sight. It was not that he was ashamed of her, he had told her, but people in the territory were not kind to strangers, and they were especially unkind to Indians. Until he could figure out how to explain her presence without inviting trouble, it was better if she remained hidden. The trading post was run by a man named Silas Thornton, a gaunt and suspicious character with eyes that never seemed to blink and a permanent sneer etched into his features. Caleb had never liked him, but Thornton was the only source of supplies within a day's ride, so he tolerated the man's unpleasantness for the sake of convenience. On this day, however, Thornton was not alone. Three men sat around the pot-bellied stove in the corner of the store, strangers with hard eyes and the look of men who had ridden far and fast. They wore the clothing of hunters or trackers, rough leather and heavy wool, and their hands never strayed far from the weapons at their belts. They stopped talking when Caleb entered, and their eyes followed him as he made his way to the counter. Caleb made his purchases quickly, keeping his head down and his words brief. He could feel the stranger's eyes on him, assessing, calculating. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, an instinct honed by years of living in dangerous places. These men were looking for something, or someone. He was loading supplies onto his horse when one of the strangers approached him. The man was tall and lean, with a scar running down the left side of his face and eyes the color of dirty ice. He asked if Caleb had seen any Indians in the area, a woman specifically, big, strong, with black hair. She had stolen something valuable from a man down south, and there was a reward for her return. Caleb felt his blood run cold, but he kept his expression neutral. He told the man he had not seen anyone matching that description. The mountains were quiet this time of year, and he lived alone. The scarred man studied him for a long moment, his flat eyes giving away nothing. Then he nodded and returned to his companions, and Caleb mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. But he could feel those eyes boring into him the entire way home, and he knew that this was not the end of it. When he returned to the cabin, he found Kaya splitting wood behind the stable. She looked up at his approach, and her expression shifted immediately from neutral to alert. She could read the tension in his posture, the set of his jaw. She asked what was wrong. Caleb told her about the men at the trading post, about the questions they had asked. Kaya's face went pale beneath her copper skin, and for the first time since he had known her, he saw real fear in her eyes. She said it was Grey Wolf. He had sent trackers after her. She had known he would never let her go, but she had hoped she had run far enough, hidden well enough, that he would eventually give up. Caleb asked how far Grey Wolf would go to reclaim her. Kaya's answer was bleak. Grey Wolf was not just seeking revenge. He was sending a message to everyone in the tribe who might think about defying him. Kaya was not just a runaway. She was an example that had to be made. He would never stop. He would send more men, better men, and eventually they would find her. Caleb stood silent for a moment, processing this information. He looked at Kaya, at the fear she was trying so hard to hide, at the pride that would not let her beg for help, even when her life was in danger. And he made a decision that surprised even himself. He told her that she was not going anywhere. Those men did not know she was here, and even if they found out, they would have to go through him to get to her. He had spent 5 years waiting to die in these mountains. Maybe it was time he found something worth fighting for instead. Kaya stared at him, her dark eyes wide with something that might have been shock or gratitude, or both. She told him he did not know what he was getting into. Grey Wolf was dangerous. His men were killers. Getting involved with her was a death sentence. Caleb met her gaze steadily. He told her that he had lost everything once before, and he had survived by telling himself that nothing mattered anymore. He had been wrong. She had shown him that life was worth fighting for, that there were still things worth protecting. He was not going to walk away. Not now, not ever. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to fully explore. Then Kaya did something unexpected. She stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. Her touch was warm, even through the fabric of his shirt, and her eyes, when she looked up at him, were brighter than he had ever seen them. She told him that he was either the bravest man she had ever met or the most foolish. She hoped for both their sakes that it was the former. Then she stepped back, her hand falling away, and the moment passed. But something had changed between them. Another barrier coming down, another step towards something that neither of them had words for yet. That night, they sat together by the fire, closer than they had ever sat before. They did not speak about Grey Wolf or the trackers or the danger that was surely coming. Instead, they talked about small things, ordinary things, the kind of conversation that two people might have if they were simply living their lives instead of waiting for the axe to fall. And when Kaya finally fell asleep, her hand had drifted across the floor to rest near Caleb's, their fingers not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth. Outside in the cold darkness of the Colorado night, the trackers were still out there somewhere. But inside the cabin, two people had found something worth protecting. And come what may, they would protect it together. The trackers returned 4 days later. Caleb spotted them from the ridge above his property, three figures on horseback moving slowly through the snow. They were not heading directly for his cabin, but they were close, too close, their path taking them along the valley floor, where they would have a clear view of his homestead. He watched them through his rifle scope until they disappeared over a rise to the east, then rode back to the cabin at full speed. Kaya was waiting for him when he arrived, her expression telling him that she already knew. She had seen them too from the window. She told him she should leave. It was not too late for her to draw them away to lead them on a chase through the mountains while Caleb stayed safe. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her. She did not want to leave any more than he wanted her to go. Caleb told her flatly that she was not going anywhere. If those men wanted trouble, they would find it. But they would not find her. Not without a fight. Kaya started to argue, but Caleb cut her off. He told her that for 5 years he had been living like a dead man going through the motions of survival without any real reason to continue. She had given him something he thought he had lost forever. A reason to care about tomorrow. He was not about to let that go without a fight. Kaya fell silent. The fear in her eyes faded, replaced by something else. Something that looked almost like hope. Then slowly she nodded. They would face this together. They spent that day preparing for the confrontation they both knew was coming. Caleb showed Kaya the hidden root cellar behind the cabin, a space he had dug into the mountainside for storing provisions. If the trackers came while he was away, she could hide there until it was safe. He taught her the signals he would use to let her know it was all clear, the knock patterns and whistles that would tell her he was alone. Kaya absorbed it all with the focused intensity of a warrior preparing for battle. When Caleb handed her a rifle and asked if she knew how to use it, she took it from his hands and in a single fluid motion loaded, aimed, and fired at a knot on a tree 50 yards away. The bullet struck dead center. She told him that she had been using weapons since before she could walk. He should not worry about her aim. That night, neither of them slept much. They sat together by the fire rifles within reach, listening to every sound the wind made against the walls. Sometime past midnight, Kaya spoke into the darkness. She told Caleb that she had never had anyone fight for her before. In her tribe, she had always been the one fighting, always alone, always disposable. The fact that he was willing to stand beside her against enemies he had never met, enemies that were not his problem, it was something she did not know how to process. Caleb turned to look at her. In the firelight, her face was a study in contrast, the strong planes of her features softened by vulnerability. He told her that she was not disposable, not to him. And if the rest of the world had not figured that out, then the rest of the world could go to hell. Kaya was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something that took them both by surprise. She leaned over and pressed her lips to his cheek. Just briefly, just a touch of warmth against his skin. Then she pulled back and turned away, leaving Caleb frozen in place with his heart hammering against his ribs. Neither of them mentioned it afterward. But the air between them was charged with something new. Something electric, and both of them knew that whatever was coming, it was about more than just survival. The confrontation came on a gray morning when the clouds hung so low they seemed to touch the treetops. Caleb was returning from the stable when he saw them. Three riders approaching his property from the east, moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew exactly where they were going. The scarred man from the trading post was in the lead, and beside him rode two others whose faces Caleb did not recognize, but whose bearing marked them as dangerous. He had only seconds to decide. Kaya was in the cabin, and if he let them reach the door, there would be no way to protect her. So he did the only thing he could think of. He stepped out into the open, his rifle cradled in his arms, and waited for them to come to him. The scarred man reined in his horse about 30 yards away. His companions fanned out on either side, a formation designed to make it impossible to keep eyes on all three at once. The scarred man called out that they had heard an interesting rumor at the trading post. A man who lived alone in these mountains, a man who had not been seen for weeks. He asked if Caleb was hiding something up here. or maybe someone. Caleb kept his voice level. He told them he was not hiding anything and suggested they should turn around and go back the way they came. This was private property and trespassers were not welcome. The scarred man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He said they were not looking for trouble. They just wanted the woman. She belonged to a powerful man who wanted her back. If Caleb gave her up peacefully, they would ride away and no one would get hurt. Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle. He told them there was no woman here, just him and his horses. And if they did not leave, they were going to discover exactly how unwelcome trespassers could be. The standoff stretched for an eternity compressed into seconds. The wind howled across the clearing, kicking up snow that stung like needles. Caleb could see the calculations happening behind the scarred man's eyes, the weighing of risks and rewards. 3 against 1 were good odds, but Caleb had the high ground in the cover of his homestead. It would not be an easy fight. Then from the corner of his eye, Caleb caught movement. One of the riders was edging his horse toward the cabin, trying to circle around while the scarred man held his attention. Caleb swung his rifle toward the moving man. He told him to stay where he was. The tension shattered. The rider went for his gun. Caleb fired. The shot echoed across the mountains like thunder, and the rider slumped in his saddle, clutching his shoulder. The other two went for their weapons, but before they could draw, another shot rang out from the cabin. The second rider screamed and fell from his horse, his leg bleeding from a wound just above the knee. Kaya stood in the doorway, rifle raised, her face set in the cold expression of someone who had done this before and would do it again without hesitation. Her aim was as true as it had been in practice, and the message was clear. They were not dealing with a lone rancher anymore. They were dealing with two armed combatants who knew how to fight. The scarred man froze his hand halfway to his holster. He looked from Caleb to Kaya and back again, calculating his odds. Then slowly he raised his hands. He told them this was not over. Grey Wolf would send more men, better men, and next time they would not bother asking politely. Caleb told him to take his wounded friends and get off his land. If any of them ever came back, they would not leave alive. The scarred man gathered his companions, the wounded men moaning in pain, and they rode away. Caleb watched them until they disappeared over the ridge, his rifle still raised and ready. Only then did he lower his weapon and turn to Kaya. She was still standing in the doorway, her weapon pointed at the empty space where the riders had been. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were walled with a mixture of fear and something darker. She told him she was sorry. She had brought this to his door. She should have left when she had the chance. Caleb crossed to her and gently pushed the rifle barrel down. He told her to stop apologizing. Those men had made their choice, and so had he. She was staying, and that was final. Kaya stared at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. Then without warning, she dropped the rifle and threw her arms around him. It was not a romantic embrace. It was the desperate clutch of someone who had been fighting alone for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand with them. Caleb held her, feeling her body shake with emotions she had spent years suppressing. He stroked her hair and whispered that it was going to be all right. They had won this round, and whatever came next, they would face it together. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were dry, but something in them had changed. She told him that she would stay, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this was where she wanted to be, with him. Caleb nodded. They both knew that the danger was not over, that Grey Wolf would not give up so easily. But in that moment, standing in the doorway of his cabin with the woman who had upended his entire world, Caleb felt something he had not felt in 5 years. Hope, fragile and uncertain, but real. And as the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow, they walked back into the cabin together. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. Word spread through the territory faster than Caleb would have liked. By the time March arrived, whispers had reached every settlement within 50 miles about the rancher in the mountains who was hiding an Indian woman who had shot 2 men in cold blood when they came to claim her. The story grew in the telling, as stories always do. Some said the woman was a witch who had enchanted Caleb with dark Apache magic. Others said she was a war criminal responsible for raids that had killed dozens of settlers. A few claimed she was not a woman at all, but some kind of demon in human form, sent to corrupt good Christian men. The truth, as usual, mattered less than the fear. Caleb rode into town for supplies on a bitterly cold morning in mid-March, and the reception he received was unlike anything he had experienced in his 5 years in the territory. People who had once greeted him with neutral nods now crossed to the other side of the street as he passed. Mothers pulled their children closer when they saw him coming. The shopkeeper, who had always been friendly, charged him double for flour and made a point of counting the coins 3 times before accepting them, as if Caleb might have paid him in cursed gold. At the general store, a group of men fell silent when he entered. He could feel their eyes on his back as he gathered his supplies, hostile and suspicious. One of them, a rancher named Henderson, whose land bordered the valley below Caleb's property, spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. He said it was a shame when a man forgot where his loyalties lay, when he chose savages over his own kind. Caleb did not respond. He paid for his supplies and left without making eye contact with any of them. But as he was loading his horse, Henderson followed him outside, flanked by 2 other men. The rancher planted himself in Caleb's path, arms crossed, jaw set. Henderson told Caleb that folks were talking. They said he was harboring a dangerous Indian up on his mountain, a woman who had done terrible things. He wanted to know if it was true. Caleb looked at him steadily and told him that who he had on his property was none of anyone's business. Henderson's face reddened. He said it was everyone's business when settlers were trying to build a civilized community, and there were people like Caleb bringing in wild Indians to live among decent folk. The territory had laws, he said, laws about who belonged and who did not. If Caleb would not remove the woman himself, maybe the community would have to do it for him. Caleb felt his temper rising but kept his voice controlled. He pointed out that Kaya had not done anything to anyone in this territory. She was not wild and she was not dangerous. The only people who should be worried about her were the ones who tried to hurt her. Henderson took a step back at the cold steel in Caleb's eyes, but his expression remained hostile. He told Caleb that this was not over. People would not stand for it. Then he turned and walked back to the store, his companions following like dogs at heel. Caleb rode home with his supplies and a growing sense of unease. The confrontation with the trackers had been dangerous, but at least it had been straightforward. An enemy he could see, a threat he could meet with rifle and resolve. This was different. This was a community turning against him, neighbors who had been neutral for 5 years, suddenly deciding that he was the enemy. There was no easy way to fight that. When he returned to the cabin and told Kaya what had happened, her reaction surprised him. Instead of fear or anger, she simply nodded as if she had expected nothing else. She told him that this was how it always was. No matter where she went, people feared what they did not understand. She had spent her whole life being treated as something other than human, as a threat simply because she existed. The only difference now was that Caleb was caught in the crossfire. She told him she could leave. It was not too late. If she disappeared, the town would eventually forget, and Caleb could go back to his quiet life. She did not want to be the reason he lost everything. Caleb sat down across from her and took her hands in his. He told her that his quiet life had been a slow death, a way of existing without really living. She had changed that. She had reminded him what it meant to care about something, to fight for something, to wake up in the morning with a reason to face the day. He was not going to give that up because some small-minded people were afraid of what they did not understand. Kaya studied his face for a long moment, and then slowly she smiled. It was the second real smile he had seen from her, and it lit up her face like sunrise over the mountains. She told him he was a stubborn fool. He agreed that he probably was. They both laughed, and for a moment the weight of the world felt a little lighter. But the laughter did not last. 3 days later, a group of men from town rode up to Caleb's property. There were 8 of them, led by Henderson the rancher, who had confronted him in town. They stopped at the fence line, their horses stamping nervously in the cold, and Henderson called out that they wanted to talk. Caleb stepped onto the porch, his rifle visible but not raised. Kaya watched from the window, hidden from sight, but ready to act if needed. Henderson announced that he was speaking for the decent citizens of the territory. They had tolerated Caleb's peculiarities for years, his isolation, his refusal to join community events, his general standoffishness. But harboring a savage was a step too far. They were giving him one chance to make this right. He needed to send the woman away, or there would be consequences. Caleb listened without interrupting. When Henderson finished, he asked what kind of consequences they had in mind. Henderson smiled unpleasantly. He said they could make life very difficult for a man who depended on the town for supplies and trade. They could refuse to do business with him. They could spread word to the army post not to buy his horses. They could, even if pushed far enough, take matters into their own hands. Caleb looked at the 8 men arrayed before him. He recognized most of them as people he had done business with over the years, people he had never particularly liked, but had never actively disliked either. Farmers and ranchers and shopkeepers, ordinary men who had decided that fear was more important than fairness. Now seeing the hostility in their eyes, he felt nothing but contempt. He told them that the woman was staying. If they did not like it, they could take it up with the mountains. He was done talking. Henderson's face contorted with rage. He started to say something, but another man in the group grabbed his arm and whispered urgently. Caleb caught fragments of the exchange. Something about reinforcements, about waiting for the right time. Henderson mastered himself with visible effort. He told Caleb that this was not over. Then he wheeled his horse around and led the group away. Kaya emerged from the cabin after they left. Her face was carefully blank, but Caleb could see the tension in her shoulders, the readiness for violence that never quite left her. She told him he had just made enemies of an entire town. Caleb shrugged. He said he had never been good at making friends anyway. Kaya shook her head, but the corner of her mouth twitched. She told him again that he was a stubborn fool. But this time there was something warmer in her voice, something that sounded almost like affection. They went back inside together, and if their shoulders brushed as they walked through the door, neither of them mentioned it. But the touch lingered, a small warmth against the cold that surrounded them on all sides. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of tension and tenderness. The threat from the town hung over them like a storm cloud, but within the walls of the cabin, something was changing. The careful distance that had existed between Caleb and Kaya was slowly dissolving, replaced by an intimacy that neither of them had sought, but neither could deny. It showed in small things. The way Kaya's hand would linger on his when she passed him a cup of coffee in the morning. The way Caleb found excuses to be close to her, helping with tasks she could have easily managed alone. The way they sat together by the fire each night, no longer on opposite sides of the room, but side by side, their shoulders touching, their silences comfortable and warm. One evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Kaya spoke about her past in a way she never had before. She told Caleb about her father, about the way he had looked at her with pride instead of fear, about the songs he had sung to her on cold nights like this one. She told him about the hunting trips they had taken together, about the lessons he had taught her, about the way he had made her feel like she was exactly what she was supposed to be. Her voice grew soft as she spoke of him, and Caleb could hear the loss beneath her words. She had loved her father deeply, and his death had left a wound that had never fully healed. Without him, she had been alone in a world that did not want her, fighting for survival, with no one to watch her back. Caleb listened without interrupting, and when she fell silent, he told her about Eleanor and Thomas. He told her about the life he had built in Kansas City, about the dreams he and Eleanor had shared for their future, about the joy of watching his son take his first steps. He told her about the cholera, about the helpless horror of watching his family die, about the years he had spent trying to outrun a grief that followed him like a shadow. It was the first time he had spoken of them to anyone since their deaths. The words came out rough and raw, rusty from years of silence. But once he started, he could not seem to stop. He told her everything, the good memories and the terrible ones, the love and the loss, and the long empty years that had followed. When he finished, Kaya was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. She told him that she was sorry, not with the empty platitudes that most people offered, but with a quiet sincerity that made the words mean something. She told him that grief was a hunter that never stopped tracking you. The only choice was whether you let it catch you or learn to run alongside it. Caleb looked at her, this woman who had survived things he could not imagine, and felt something crack open in his chest. For so long, he had kept his heart walled off, protected from any possibility of further pain. But Kaya had found a way through those walls, not by battering them down, but by simply being there, patient and present and understanding. He told her that for 5 years he had believed he would never feel anything again. He had convinced himself that his heart had died with Eleanor and Thomas, that he was just a shell going through the motions of living. She had proved him wrong. Kaya turned to look at him, and in the fading light her eyes were bright with emotion. She asked what he meant. Caleb did not answer with words. Instead, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But she did not pull away. After a moment of surprise, she kissed him back, her free hand coming up to cup his face, her lips soft against his. They stayed like that for a long moment, the kiss deepening years of loneliness and longing, pouring out in the simple act of connection. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Kaya's eyes searched his face, looking for doubt or regret, but she found neither. Caleb told her that he loved her. The words came out easier than he had expected, as if they had been waiting to be spoken for weeks. Kaya's breath caught. She told him that she had never expected to hear those words from anyone. She had been told her whole life that she was unlovable, that her strength made her monstrous, that no man would ever want her for anything but her usefulness. Caleb cupped her face in his hands. He told her that her strength was what he loved most about her. Not despite it, but because of it. She had survived things that would have broken most people, and instead of becoming bitter or cruel, she had remained kind. That was not weakness. That was the greatest strength of all. Kaya closed her eyes and a single tear tracked down her cheek. Then she leaned forward and kissed him again, and in that kiss was everything she could not say in words. The loneliness of years, the pain of rejection, the desperate hope that maybe finally she had found a place where she belonged. That night they did not sleep on opposite sides of the room. They lay together in Caleb's bed, not yet as lovers in the physical sense, but as something deeper. Partners, companions, two souls who had found in each other the strength to keep going. And when the dawn came, they watched the light creep across the ceiling together, and both of them knew that whatever came next, they would face it as one. April arrived with a rush of warmth that melted the last of the winter snow. The streams swelled with meltwater, the trees began to bud, and the world transformed from white and gray to 1,000 shades of green. It was the most beautiful spring Caleb could remember, and he found himself noticing things he had ignored for years. The way the light fell through the trees in the morning, the sound of birds returning to the valley, the smell of the earth coming back to life. He knew that Kaya was the reason for this renewed awareness. She had awakened something in him that had been dormant for so long he had forgotten it existed. The capacity for joy, the ability to appreciate beauty, the simple pleasure of being alive. They had become lovers in the fullest sense, their physical intimacy growing naturally from the emotional connection they had built over months. Kaya was passionate and tender by turns, fierce in her desires but gentle in her touch. She approached lovemaking the way she approached everything else, with complete commitment and an intensity that took Caleb's breath away. But beyond the physical, there was something deeper. A partnership that went beyond words. They worked together seamlessly now, anticipating each other's needs, covering each other's weaknesses. Caleb taught Kaya to read and write in English, sitting together by the fire in the evenings, while she laboriously traced letters on a slate. Kaya taught Caleb the Apache language, sharing the songs her father had sung to her, the stories that had been passed down through generations. The cabin that had once felt like a prison now felt like a sanctuary, a place where two wounded souls could heal together, protected from the hostility of the outside world. But the outside world had not forgotten them. In mid-April, Lieutenant Marcus Webb rode up to the cabin with a small detachment of soldiers from Fort Garland. The lieutenant was a fair man who had always dealt honestly with Caleb, and his expression as he dismounted was troubled. He told Caleb that word had reached the fort about the situation in the territory. The commanding officer had received complaints from local citizens about an Indian woman living in the area, and about violence that had been done to men who came to collect her. The army was required to investigate. Caleb felt his heart sink, but he kept his expression neutral. He asked what the army intended to do. Webb sighed. He said that officially the army's position was that Indians belonged on reservations. If Kaya was a runaway from a tribe, she should be returned. But the lieutenant also said that he had known Caleb for 5 years, and he had always found him to be an honest man. He wanted to hear Caleb's side of the story before making any decisions. Caleb told him everything. He told him about finding Kaya in the storm, about the wounds she had suffered, about the men who had come to take her back. He told him about Grey Wolf and the abuse Kaya had endured, about her escape and her desperate journey through the wilderness. He told him about the threats from the town and the confrontation with the trackers. Through it all, Webb listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, the lieutenant was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked to speak with Kaya herself. Caleb hesitated. He knew that Kaya did not trust soldiers any more than she trusted anyone else. But he also knew that refusing would only make things worse. He went inside and explained the situation to her, and after a moment of consideration, she agreed to come out. Webb studied her with careful eyes as she approached. He asked her to tell him her story in her own words. Kaya looked at him for a long moment, assessing, calculating. Then she began to speak. She told him about her life in the tribe, about the father who had raised her with love, about the elders who had feared and hated her for being different. She told him about Grey Wolf and his cruelty, about the beatings and the scars, about the choice she had been given between submission and death. She told him about her escape and the months of running about the men who had tried to use her and the ones she had been forced to kill. Her voice was steady throughout, but Caleb could see the effort it cost her to lay bare her pain to a stranger. When she finished, Webb was silent for a long time. Finally, the lieutenant spoke. He told them that legally his hands were tied. The Army had agreements with the tribes, and those agreements included provisions for returning runaways. But he also said that the Army's priority was keeping the peace, and it seemed to him that the greatest threat to peace in this territory was not Kaya, but the men who were hunting her. He told Caleb that he would file a report stating that he had investigated the situation and found no evidence of wrongdoing. He would recommend that no further action be taken against either of them. It was not a guarantee of safety, but it was something. Caleb thanked him and the lieutenant mounted his horse. Before he rode away, he turned back to them. He told them to be careful. Grey Wolf had connections that reached beyond the territory. The fact that his trackers had failed would only make him more determined. And the people in town were not going to forget their grievances anytime soon. Caleb assured him they would be careful. Webb nodded and led his soldiers away, leaving them alone once more. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Kaya asked Caleb if he thought they would ever be safe, if there would ever come a day when they could simply live their lives without fear. Caleb considered the question. He told her honestly that he did not know. The world was not kind to people like them, people who did not fit into the neat categories that society demanded. But he also told her that safety was not what he cared about most. What he cared about was being with her, facing whatever came together, building a life that was worth living, regardless of the dangers. Kaya was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to face him in the darkness, her hand coming up to rest on his chest. She told him that she had spent her whole life searching for a place where she belonged, a place where she could be herself without apology, without fear. She had finally found that place. It was not the cabin, it was not the mountains, it was him. He was her home. Caleb pulled her close and held her tight. He told her that she was his home too, the first real home he had had since Eleanor and Thomas died. They fell asleep in each other's arms, and for once neither of them dreamed of the past. They dreamed of the future, of the life they would build together, of the family they might someday have. Dreams that felt fragile and precious and worth protecting at any cost. But in the hills above the valley, hidden among the rocks and trees, a figure watched the cabin through the glass of a stolen telescope. Grey Wolf had arrived at last, and with him had come an army of Shadow's men, without conscience or mercy, loyal only to the silver and the promise of blood. The hunt was about to enter its final phase. The first indication that something had changed came 3 days later. Caleb was checking his trap lines in the forest when he noticed tracks that did not belong. Not the tracks of deer or elk, but of men. Many men moving in careful formation through the underbrush. He followed them as far as he dared and found what he had feared most. A camp had been established in a hidden canyon about 2 miles from his property. From a vantage point on the ridge above, Caleb counted at least 15 men moving among the tents and horses. They were well armed and well supplied, and they moved with the disciplined efficiency of experienced warriors. This was not another group of trackers. This was an invasion force. And at the center of the camp, directing the activity with gestures that spoke of absolute authority, was a figure that made Caleb's blood run cold. Tall and silver-haired, with the bearing of a chief and the eyes of a predator. Grey Wolf had come himself. Caleb retreated as silently as he had come, his mind racing. 15 men was more than he and Kaya could hope to fight off alone. Even with the advantage of their position and their familiarity with the terrain, they would be overwhelmed. They needed help, but the town had turned against them, and the army had its hands tied by politics and treaties. When he returned to the cabin and told Kaya what he had seen, her reaction was not what he expected. Instead of fear, her face went hard and still, the mask of a warrior settling over her features. She told him that she had known this day would come. Grey Wolf never gave up. He had traveled 1,000 miles to reclaim what he considered his property, and he would not leave without her. Caleb asked what she wanted to do. Kaya looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes, and her voice was steady when she answered. She told him she was done running. She had run for nearly a year from Arizona to Colorado, from one temporary refuge to another. It had not saved her. Nothing would save her except ending the threat once and for all. If Grey Wolf wanted her, he would have to take her, and she would make him pay for every step. They spent the next 2 days preparing for the assault they knew was coming. Caleb fortified the cabin as best he could, reinforcing the walls with additional logs, creating firing positions at each window, stockpiling ammunition and supplies. Kaya worked beside him with grim efficiency, her warrior training evident in every decision she made. On the second night, as they sat together cleaning their weapons by the fire, Caleb asked Kaya to tell him more about Grey Wolf, not the monster of her nightmares, but the man himself. What made him tick? What were his weaknesses? If they were going to survive this, they needed every advantage they could get. Kaya was silent for a long moment, her hands still on the rifle she had been oiling. Then she began to speak, and her voice carried the weight of years of painful knowledge. Grey Wolf, she said, was not just cruel. He was intelligent, ruthlessly, dangerously intelligent. He had risen to power in the tribe through a combination of violence and manipulation, eliminating rivals and cultivating allies until there was no one left to challenge him. He did not rule through fear alone, though fear was certainly part of it. He ruled because people believed he was invincible, because every enemy who had ever stood against him had ended up broken or dead. His weakness, if he had one, was his pride. He believed himself to be a living legend, a great chief destined for eternal glory. He could not tolerate any challenge to that belief, any hint that he might be fallible or mortal. Kaya's defiance had wounded him, not just personally but politically. If a mere woman could stand against him and escape, what did that say about his power? He would never stop hunting her, because stopping would mean admitting that she had beaten him, and that was something his ego could not survive. Caleb listened carefully, filing away every piece of information. When she finished, he asked one more question. Was there any chance of reasoning with him, of negotiating some kind of truce? Kaya laughed, but there was no humor in it. She told him that Grey Wolf did not negotiate. He conquered. The only language he understood was force. Caleb nodded slowly. Then they would speak his language. The attack came at dawn on the third day. Caleb was awake and watching when the first figures emerged from the tree line, moving in the gray half-light like ghosts. He had stationed himself at the window facing east, where the terrain provided the most likely approach. Kaya was at the west window covering the rear. Between them, they had clear sight lines to every possible avenue of assault. He counted the men as they spread out around the property. 12 visible, which meant at least 3 more hidden somewhere as reserves. They were good moving with minimal noise and maximum coordination, but they were not good enough. Caleb had been watching the terrain for days, and he knew every shadow, every rock, every tree that might provide cover. The first shot was his. A man trying to creep along the fence line dropped without a sound, and suddenly the quiet morning erupted into chaos. Grey Wolf's warriors broke from cover and charged their rifles, barking bullets, thudding into the cabin walls. Caleb and Kaya returned fire, methodical and precise, making every shot count. 3 more attackers fell in the first minute, but the rest kept coming. They reached the fence and used it for cover, pouring fire into the cabin, while others circled around the sides. Smoke from the guns filled the air, mixed with the shouts of men and the screaming of horses in the stable. Caleb caught a movement from the corner of his eye and swung his rifle toward a man trying to climb through the window. The shot took the man in the chest and he fell back with a grunt. But the distraction cost Caleb precious seconds, and when he turned back to the main assault, he saw that 2 more attackers had reached the front door. They hit it with a battering ram and the wood splintered but held. Caleb fired through the door itself and one of the men screamed and stumbled away. But the other one was still there, still hitting the door, and Caleb knew it would not hold much longer. He shouted to Kaya to cover him and ran to the door. Just as it burst open, he was there, rifle butt swinging. The first man threw, took the blow to the face and went down. The second man had a knife, and Caleb felt the blade slice across his arm before he could react. He grabbed the man's wrist and twisted, feeling bones crack, then drove his elbow into the man's throat. More attackers were coming through the door. Caleb drew his pistol and fired point blank once, twice, 3 times. Bodies fell, but there were more behind them, always more. He was bleeding from the cut on his arm and from a dozen other wounds he did not remember receiving. His ammunition was running low. Then he heard Kaya scream. He spun around and saw her on the floor struggling with a massive warrior who had somehow gotten through the rear window. The man had her pinned his hands around her throat, his face twisted with effort as he tried to choke the life out of her. Caleb did not think. He simply moved. He crossed the room in 3 strides and brought the butt of his pistol down on the back of the warrior's skull. The man collapsed, but before Caleb could help Kaya to her feet, something hit him from behind. The world went white, then black, and he was falling. When he woke, the cabin was in ruins. Sunlight streamed through holes in the walls, illuminating a scene of devastation. Bodies lay everywhere, Grey Wolf's men and others he did not recognize. The floor was slick with blood, some of it his own, and his head throbbed with a pain that made it hard to think. He tried to rise and failed, his arms refusing to support his weight. After several attempts, he managed to push himself up onto his hands and knees, then slowly, agonizingly to his feet. The room swam around him, and he had to grab the wall to keep from falling. Kaya. He had to find Kaya. He searched the cabin, stepping over bodies, calling her name. She was not there. He stumbled outside, still calling, his voice growing more desperate with each shout. The stable was a smoking ruin, the horses either dead or scattered. The fence was torn down in a dozen places. And everywhere he looked, he saw the evidence of the battle that had raged while he lay unconscious. But there was no sign of Kaya. Then he saw the tracks. Horses heading east, and among them the unmistakable marks of someone being dragged. Grey Wolf had taken her. Caleb stood in the wreckage of everything he had built, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and terror. The woman he loved, his partner, his reason for living, was in the hands of a monster who would stop at nothing to break her. And he was wounded alone with nothing left but the burning need to get her back. He looked up at the sky where the sun was rising over the mountains. In that moment he made a vow, a promise sealed with blood and fire. He would find Kaya, he would save her, and he would kill Grey Wolf if it was the last thing he ever did. The hunt had begun. Caleb spent 2 days recovering enough strength to travel. He bound his wounds with strips torn from his own clothing, ate what little food remained in the ruined cabin, and tried to ignore the pain that throbbed through his body with every heartbeat. He could not afford to wait any longer. Every hour that passed was another hour that Kaya was in the hands of a man who had made her life a living hell. On the 3rd day, he caught one of his horses that had escaped the slaughter. The mare was skittish and frightened, but she calmed under his touch, remembering the years of kindness he had shown her. He saddled her with what gear he could salvage and set out on the trail. Grey Wolf's party had not bothered to hide their tracks. They were heading east toward the Badlands, where the army rarely ventured and where a man could disappear forever if he knew the terrain. Caleb pushed his horse as hard as he dared, knowing that every minute counted, but also knowing that if he exhausted his mount, he would never catch them. The trail led through some of the most unforgiving country in Colorado. Deep canyons carved by ancient rivers, mesas that rose like stone fortresses from the desert floor, and endless stretches of scrubland where the only living things were rattlesnakes and scorpions. Caleb had never been this far east before, but he followed the tracks with the single-minded determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. On the 4th day, he found their camp. It was nestled in a canyon protected on 3 sides by sheer rock walls, accessible only through a narrow pass that was easily defended. From a vantage point on the ridge above, Caleb studied the layout with careful eyes. At least 12 men remained, plus Grey Wolf himself, who sat by the fire with the arrogance of a king surveying his domain. And there, tied to a post near the center of the camp, was Kaya. Even from a distance, Caleb could see that she had been beaten. Her face was bruised, her clothing torn, her proud head bowed with exhaustion. But she was alive, and as long as she was alive, there was hope. Caleb spent the rest of the day observing the camp, memorizing the positions of the guards, the routines of the men, the layout of the terrain. He counted his ammunition: 14 bullets for his rifle, 6 for his pistol, 20 shots against 12 armed men. The odds were impossible, but he had faced impossible odds before, and he had survived. He would do it again. That night, under cover of darkness, he moved into position. The first guard died without a sound, Caleb's knife opening his throat before the man could cry out. The second fell to a silent shot, the report muffled by the canyon walls. Caleb moved through the camp like a ghost, picking off men one by one, using every trick he had learned in 5 years of wilderness survival. But even ghosts make mistakes. On his seventh kill, a dying man managed to squeeze off a shot that echoed through the canyon like thunder. The camp erupted into chaos. Men scrambled for their weapons, shouting in Apache, searching for the source of the attack. And Grey Wolf, moving with terrifying speed, drew his knife and pressed it to Kaya's throat. The silver-haired chief called out into the darkness, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. He told the intruder to show himself or the woman would die. Caleb had no choice. He stepped into the firelight with his rifle raised, knowing that he was giving up his greatest advantage, but unable to let Kaya die. Grey Wolf studied him with cold amusement. So this was the white man who had been protecting his property, he said. The fool who thought he could steal what belonged to the great Grey Wolf. Caleb did not flinch. He told Grey Wolf that Kaya did not belong to anyone. She was a free woman and she would stay that way. Grey Wolf laughed, but there was no humor in it. He told Caleb that he admired his courage even if he pitied his stupidity. He could have lived out his days in peace if he had simply handed over the woman when his trackers came. Now he would die, and she would suffer for his defiance. Caleb held the rifle steady, his aim fixed on Grey Wolf's head. He told the chief that if he hurt Kaya, he would not live long enough to enjoy his victory. At this range, even if Grey Wolf killed her, Caleb's bullet would find its mark a heartbeat later. The standoff stretched for an eternal moment. Around them, Grey Wolf's remaining men had formed a circle, their weapons trained on Caleb. 5 men still standing, plus Grey Wolf himself. The odds were still terrible, but they were better than they had been. Then Kaya moved. Her bound hands came up, catching the knife blade and twisting it away from her throat. Blood sprayed from her palms, but she did not stop. She drove her elbow back into Grey Wolf's face, breaking his nose, and tore free from his grasp before he could recover. The camp exploded into violence. Caleb fired into the mass of men rushing toward him, each shot finding its mark. Kaya fought like a demon despite her wounds, disarming one man and using his own weapon against him. Grey Wolf screamed orders that no one obeyed his authority, crumbling in the face of unexpected resistance. One by one, Grey Wolf's men fell. Some died from Caleb's bullets. Others fell to Kaya's ferocious counterattack. The survivors broke and ran, disappearing into the darkness, their loyalty to their chief evaporating in the face of defeat. In the end, only Grey Wolf remained. The silver-haired chief stood in the center of the camp, blood streaming from his broken nose, his eyes burning with hatred. He had drawn a second knife, and he held it before him like a talisman, as if the blade alone could protect him from the destruction of everything he had built. Caleb raised his pistol. He told Grey Wolf that it was over. The hunt was finished. He could surrender and face justice, or he could die here in the dirt. The choice was his. Grey Wolf's lip curled in contempt. He told Caleb that he would never surrender to a white man. He would never admit defeat to a savage-loving fool who did not understand the natural order of the world. If he was going to die, he would take them both with him. He lunged at Kaya, the knife aimed at her heart. Caleb fired. The bullet took Grey Wolf in the chest, and he staggered but did not fall. He took another step toward Kaya, his face twisted with murderous rage, the knife still clutched in his hand. Caleb fired again. This time Grey Wolf went down. He lay on his back in the dust, staring up at the stars, his breath coming in wet, rattling gasps. Kaya stood over him, looking down at the man who had tormented her for years, the monster who had haunted her nightmares. Grey Wolf coughed and blood bubbled from his lips. With his last breath, he told Kaya that she would never escape. Even in death, he would haunt her. She would never be free of him. Kaya looked at him with eyes that held no fear, no hatred, only a cold and terrible peace. She told him that he was wrong. She had already escaped. She had found something he could never destroy, something stronger than his cruelty or his pride. She had found love and home, and a man who was worth more than Grey Wolf could ever understand. Grey Wolf tried to speak again, but the words would not come. His eyes glazed over and his body went still. And just like that, the great chief who had terrorized an entire tribe was nothing more than a corpse in the dirt. Kaya stood there for a long moment, staring down at him. Then she turned away and walked to Caleb, who was waiting for her with open arms. She fell into his embrace, her body shaking with sobs she had held back for years, all the fear and pain and rage finally finding release. Caleb held her tight and whispered that it was over. They were safe. They could go home. The journey back took them more than a week. Both of them were wounded, exhausted, operating on nothing but willpower and the desperate need to survive. They traveled slowly, resting, often taking care of each other's injuries with what little supplies they had. But despite the hardship, there was a lightness between them that had not been there before. The shadow that had hung over them since Kaya first arrived at Caleb's gate had finally lifted. Grey Wolf was dead. His men were scattered or killed. The threat that had driven them together was gone. As they rode through the high country, watching the aspens turn gold with the approach of autumn, they talked about the future in ways they never had before. They talked about rebuilding the cabin, about expanding the homestead, about the life they would build together now that they were finally free. Kaya told Caleb that she wanted to have children. She had never thought that she would want such a thing, had never believed that anyone would want to have children with her. But with him, everything was different. She wanted to create something together, to bring new life into the world and raise it with love and strength. Caleb's heart swelled at her words. He told her that he wanted that too. He had thought that part of his life was over, that he would never again experience the joy of fatherhood. But Kaya had shown him that it was never too late for a second chance. They made camp that night by a clear mountain stream, and as they lay together under the stars, they made love with a tenderness that went beyond passion. It was a communion of souls, a celebration of survival, a promise of the future they would build together. And when the morning came, they continued their journey home, two people who had been broken by the world and had somehow found in each other the strength to become whole. They reached the valley in early October when the mountains were ablaze with autumn color. The cabin was a ruin just as Caleb had left it, but the sight did not fill him with despair. It filled him with determination. They would rebuild. They would make it better than before. To their surprise, they were not alone. Lieutenant Webb was waiting for them with a small detachment of soldiers. The lieutenant's face showed relief when he saw them, and he explained that he had heard about the battle with Grey Wolf's men and had come to investigate. He had feared the worst. Caleb thanked him for his concern and told him what had happened. Webb listened without interrupting his expression, growing more grave as the story unfolded. When Caleb finished, the lieutenant was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. He told them that Grey Wolf had been wanted by the army for years for crimes across 3 territories. His death would be celebrated by many, including several tribes who had suffered under his influence. Webb would file a report stating that Caleb and Kaya had acted in self-defense, and he would recommend that no charges be brought against either of them. But there was something else. Webb reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a document official-looking with a red seal at the bottom. He told Caleb that he had taken the liberty of drawing up some paperwork while they were gone. It was a declaration of residency granting Kaya legal status in the territory as a permanent resident under Caleb's protection. It was not citizenship, and it would not make everyone accept her, but it was a start. Caleb took the document with trembling hands. He looked at Kaya, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. He thanked Webb, not knowing what else to say. The lieutenant smiled and told them to take care of each other. Then he mounted his horse and led his soldiers away, leaving them alone in the ruins of their home. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Caleb took Kaya to the place where they would rebuild. It was a clearing at the edge of the forest overlooking the valley, with a view of the peaks that stretched to the horizon. He had always thought it was the most beautiful spot on his property, and now it would be the site of their new beginning. He took her hands in his and looked into her eyes. He told her that he wanted to marry her, not because she needed protection and not because of any piece of paper, but because he loved her, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, and he wanted the whole world to know it. Kaya looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled. It was the third real smile he had seen from her, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. She told him yes. She would marry him. She would build a life with him. She would love him until the day she died and beyond. They kissed as the last light faded from the sky, and the mountains stood silent witness to their promise. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had survived everything the world could throw at them, who had earned their happiness through blood and tears and an unbreakable will to live. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of promise. There would be challenges ahead, struggles they could not foresee, hardships they would have to endure. But they would face them together as they had faced everything else. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The wedding took place 2 weeks later on a crisp autumn day when the aspens were at their peak of golden glory. It was a simple ceremony held in the clearing where they planned to build their new home. There were no guests except the mountains and the horses that grazed nearby. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt, the one he saved for trips to town, and he had trimmed his beard and combed his hair for the occasion. Kaya wore a dress she had made herself from trade cloth decorated with beadwork in Apache patterns that held meanings he did not fully understand but could feel in his heart. They stood facing each other, hands clasped, and spoke the vows they had written themselves. Caleb promised to love her, to protect her, to stand beside her no matter what storms came. Kaya promised to be his partner, his warrior, his home. They promised to face the world together, to build a family together, to grow old together. When the vows were done, Caleb pulled out a ring. It was simple, a band of gold he had traded for in town, but it was the first gift he had ever given her, and he wanted it to mean something. He slipped it onto her finger and told her that she was his wife now, and nothing would ever change that. Kaya looked at the ring, then at him, and her eyes were full of tears. She told him that she had never owned anything so beautiful. She had never been given anything with so much love. She would treasure it always. They kissed to seal the bond, and the wind picked up and swept through the clearing, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, as if the land itself was blessing their union. That night they celebrated with a meal of roasted venison and wild berries, and afterward they danced together in the firelight, moving to music that only they could hear. It was not the grand society wedding that Caleb's first marriage had been. There were no guests, no minister, no fancy decorations. But it was real in a way that nothing else had ever been. Two souls forged by hardship, choosing each other freely and without reservation. As they lay together afterward, wrapped in blankets under the stars, Kaya turned to Caleb and told him something that would change their lives forever. She was carrying his child. The news hit Caleb like a thunderbolt. He sat up staring at her in the moonlight, not quite believing what he had heard. She told him again, her voice soft but certain. She had not been sure until recently, but now there was no doubt. Life was growing inside her, a child that was both of theirs, a blend of two worlds that had tried so hard to destroy them. Caleb found that he was crying. Tears streamed down his face, the first he had shed since the night Grey Wolf died. But these were not tears of pain. They were tears of joy, of gratitude, of a hope so fierce it hurt. He pulled Kaya into his arms and held her tight. He told her that she had given him everything, more than he had ever dared to hope for, more than he deserved. She had given him a reason to live, and now she was giving him a future. Kaya held him back, and her own tears mingled with his. She told him that they would build something beautiful together, a family, a home, a life that no one could take away from them. They lay there for a long time holding each other, watching the stars wheel overhead. The future was uncertain, as it always was. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles they could not foresee. But in that moment, none of it mattered. They had each other. They had the child growing inside Kaya. They had a home to build and a life to live. And that was everything. The winter that followed was the hardest Caleb had ever known, not because of the weather or the isolation, but because of the weight of responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. He had a wife to protect, a child on the way, and a home to rebuild from the ashes of the old one. Every decision he made carried consequences that extended beyond himself, and for a man who had spent 5 years caring about nothing but his own survival, the adjustment was profound. They lived for the first 2 months, a combination of salvaged materials from the ruined cabin and fresh timber cut from the forest. It was cramped and drafty, barely adequate for one person, let alone two, but Kaya never complained. She worked beside him every day until her growing belly made heavy labor impossible, and even then she found ways to contribute. She mended clothes, prepared meals, cared for the horses that had survived the attack. She kept their small world running while Caleb focused on building the new cabin. The new structure rose slowly but steadily through November and December. Caleb had learned from his mistakes with the first cabin, and this one was larger, stronger, better positioned against both weather and potential attack. He reinforced the walls with double layers of timber, installed shutters that could be barred from the inside, and created multiple firing positions that would allow them to defend against any future assault. He prayed they would never need such defenses, but he was not naive enough to believe that all their troubles were behind them. As the walls went up and the roof went on, Caleb found himself thinking about the future in ways he had not allowed himself to consider since Eleanor and Thomas died. He imagined children playing in the yard, a garden growing behind the house, horses grazing in expanded pastures. He imagined growing old with Kaya watching their family grow, becoming the kind of man his father had been before the war had broken him. These were dangerous thoughts, he knew. Hope was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the cruelties of an indifferent universe. But he could not stop himself from hoping anyway. Kaya's pregnancy progressed without complications, her strong body adapting to the changes with the same resilience she showed in everything else. She grew rounder and softer as the months passed, but her eyes retained their fierce intelligence and her spirit remained undiminished. She told Caleb stories about Apache traditions surrounding pregnancy and birth, about the ceremonies her mother would have performed if she had lived, about the songs that were supposed to be sung to babies while they were still in the womb. Caleb listened to these stories with deep attention, understanding that Kaya was sharing something precious with him, something that connected her to the culture she had been forced to leave behind. He asked her to teach him the songs, and together they would sit by the fire in the evenings, Kaya singing in Apache while Caleb did his best to follow along. His pronunciation was terrible, and Kaya laughed at his efforts, but her laughter was warm and loving, and he treasured it like gold. Christmas came and went without much fanfare. They had no tree, no decorations, no gifts to exchange. But on Christmas morning, Caleb surprised Kaya with something he had been working on in secret for weeks. It was a cradle carved from a single piece of oak he had salvaged from a fallen tree. He had spent countless hours shaping it, sanding it, smooth, etching patterns into the wood that echoed the beadwork on Kaya's wedding dress. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever made, and when Kaya saw it, she burst into tears. She told him it was perfect. She told him their child would sleep safe and warm in this cradle, dreaming dreams of the future they would build together. She told him she loved him more than she had ever thought possible to love another person. Caleb held her while she cried, and he found that his own eyes were not entirely dry. He had not cried on Christmas since he was a boy, but this Christmas was different. This Christmas, for the first time in years, he had something to celebrate. The new year arrived with a blast of Arctic air that dropped temperatures to levels Caleb had never experienced. The streams froze solid, the snow piled up to the windowsills, and for 3 weeks they were trapped in the half-finished cabin, unable to venture out for more than a few minutes at a time. But they had prepared well and their supplies held out. They passed the time by the fire talking and reading and planning for the spring. Kaya taught Caleb more Apache words, and he taught her more about the white world she had spent her life avoiding. They discussed names for the baby, debating the merits of English names versus Apache names, traditional names versus modern ones. In the end, they decided that if the child was a girl, she would be named Elena after Caleb's mother, with Blackwater as a middle name to honor Kaya's heritage. If it was a boy, he would be named Thomas after the son Caleb had lost with an Apache name that Kaya would choose. February brought a break in the weather, and with it an unexpected visitor. Lieutenant Webb rode up to the cabin on a gray morning, his horse steaming in the cold air. He brought news from the territory, some good and some troubling. The good news was that the Army had officially closed its investigation into the events of the previous autumn. Caleb and Kaya were cleared of all wrongdoing, and the death of Grey Wolf had been ruled self-defense. Several tribes had even sent messages of gratitude, thanking whoever had ended the chief's reign of terror. They were safe at least from official reprisals. The troubling news was that the town had not forgotten them. Henderson, the rancher who had led the delegation to Caleb's property the previous spring, had been agitating for action against them. He had written letters to the territorial governor, to newspapers, to anyone who would listen, demanding that the authorities remove the Indian woman from the territory. So far, his efforts had come to nothing, but Webb wanted Caleb to know that the threat was still out there. Caleb thanked the lieutenant for the warning and asked if there was anything he could do to protect himself and his family. Webb considered the question for a moment, then offered a suggestion. He told Caleb that the best defense against prejudice was visibility. If the people of the territory saw Kaya as a person rather than a threat, they might be less willing to support Henderson's campaign against her. It would not be easy, and it would not be safe, but it might be their best chance at long-term peace. Caleb discussed the suggestion with Kaya after Webb left. She was skeptical, pointing out that showing herself in town had never worked in her favor before. People saw what they wanted to see, and what they wanted to see in her was a savage, a threat, an outsider who did not belong. But Caleb argued that this time was different. They had allies now, or at least potential allies. The Army was on their side. Some of the settlers had been helped by Caleb over the years and might be willing to return the favor. If they could build relationships even a few at a time, they might be able to change things. In the end, Kaya agreed to try. Not because she believed it would work, but because Caleb believed it, and his hope had become her hope. They would face the world together as they had faced everything else. The first test came in late February, when Caleb needed to ride into town for supplies. For the first time since her arrival, Kaya came with him. She rode beside him on one of their horses, her back straight and her head high, refusing to show the fear that Caleb knew she must be feeling. As they entered the town, people stopped and stared. Some pointed, some whispered. A few made gestures that were clearly hostile, but not everyone. An old woman named Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had died in a blizzard 3 years ago, and whose firewood Caleb had supplied without charge, came out of her shop and greeted them with a warm smile. She told Kaya that she had heard about her and that anyone who could survive what she had survived deserved respect, not suspicion. She invited them in for coffee, and for half an hour they sat in her shop and talked about ordinary things, weather and crops and the price of flour. When they left, Kaya was quiet for a long time. Then she told Caleb that Mrs. Patterson had been the first white woman to ever speak to her like a person. She did not know what to do with that. Caleb told her to accept it, to let the kindness in even though it was frightening, even though it went against everything she had learned. Not everyone in the world was an enemy. Some people were capable of seeing past the surface to the human being beneath. Those people were rare, but they existed, and they were worth finding. Spring arrived in a rush of warmth and color that seemed to transform the world overnight. The snow melted, the streams swelled with runoff, and the meadows exploded with wildflowers. The new cabin was finished now, larger and more comfortable than the old one, with a separate bedroom for Caleb and Kaya, and a nursery for the baby that was due any day. Kaya's belly was enormous, straining against the fabric of her dresses, and she moved with the careful waddle of a woman in the final stages of pregnancy. The baby kicked constantly, and Caleb spent hours with his hand on her stomach, feeling the tiny feet and hands moving inside her. Each kick was a reminder of the miracle that was about to enter their lives, and he marveled at it every time. The birth came on a warm night in late April when the moon was full and the sky was clear. Caleb had sent word to the doctor in town, but the baby was not interested in waiting. Kaya's labor began at sunset and progressed rapidly, her strong body doing the work it had been designed to do. Caleb stayed with her through every contraction, holding her hand, wiping the sweat from her brow, telling her she was brave and strong, and that everything would be all right. He had no idea if he was helping or just getting in the way, but he could not bear to leave her alone. This was their child coming into the world, and he wanted to be there for every moment of it. The baby arrived just after midnight, sliding into Caleb's waiting hands, with a cry that split the night like a trumpet. It was a girl small and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the ages. Caleb cut the cord with hands that trembled with emotion, then wrapped the baby in a blanket and placed her in Kaya's arms. For a long moment, no one spoke. Kaya looked down at the tiny life she had brought into the world, her face transformed by an expression of love so pure that it made Caleb's chest ache. Then she looked up at him, and her eyes were shining with tears. She told him they had made something beautiful together, something that was theirs that no one could take away, something that would carry on long after they were gone. Caleb knelt beside the bed and wrapped his arms around both of them, his wife and his daughter, the family he had never expected to have. He told Kaya he loved her. He told her he loved their daughter. He told her he loved the life they had built and the future they would share. The baby yawned and closed her eyes, already drifting into sleep, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and safe and wanted. And in that moment, all the pain and loss and struggle faded away, leaving nothing but joy. They named her Elena Blackwater Stone, and she was the most precious thing either of them had ever known. The months that followed were a whirlwind of sleepless nights and precious moments. Elena was a demanding infant, crying at all hours, needing constant attention, testing the limits of her parents' endurance. But she was also a source of boundless joy, her tiny face lighting up with smiles that made every hardship worthwhile. Kaya took to motherhood with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else. She nursed Elena through the night, sang Apache lullabies to soothe her crying, carried her everywhere in a cradle board that she had made herself, following designs her father had taught her. She was tireless in her devotion, and Caleb marveled at the depth of love she showed for their daughter. For his part, Caleb discovered aspects of fatherhood he had not experienced with Thomas, who had been too young when he died for Caleb to truly know him as a person. Elena was different. From her first days, she had a personality, a presence, a way of looking at the world that was distinctly her own. She watched everything with those dark, intelligent eyes, cataloging information, making connections, learning at a pace that seemed almost supernatural. By the time she was 6 months old, she was crawling around the cabin with a speed that kept both her parents in a constant state of alert. By 9 months, she was pulling herself up on furniture and taking her first wobbly steps. By her first birthday, she was walking confidently and beginning to speak her first words, a mixture of English and Apache that delighted Kaya and bewildered Caleb. The child was a bridge between their two worlds, inheriting the best of both her parents. She had Kaya's strength and determination, Caleb's thoughtfulness and patience. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, creating a striking combination that drew comments from everyone who met her. She was quite simply extraordinary, and everyone who spent time with her could see it. The town's attitude toward the Stone family began to shift as Elena grew. It was hard to maintain hostility toward a baby, especially one as charming as Elena. When Caleb brought her into town on his trips for supplies, people who had once crossed the street to avoid him now stopped to admire his daughter. Mrs. Patterson became a regular visitor to the cabin, bringing gifts of food and clothing, and staying for long conversations with Kaya about everything from child rearing to politics. Other people followed. A young school teacher named Sarah, who had recently arrived in the territory and had no stake in the old prejudices. A retired Army sergeant named Wilson, who had served with Apache scouts and had nothing but respect for the people. A widow named Maria, whose husband had been Mexican and who knew something about being an outsider in a world that did not want her. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Stone family built a community around themselves. It was not large, and it was not without friction. Henderson and his followers remained hostile, and there were still people in town who refused to acknowledge Kaya's existence. But the circle of allies grew wider with each passing month, and with it grew a sense of safety that neither Caleb nor Kaya had ever known before. By Elena's second birthday, the Stone homestead had become something of a local landmark. Caleb's horses were renowned throughout the territory for their quality, and buyers came from as far as Denver to purchase them. Kaya had started a small business, selling beadwork and leather goods, her craftsmanship drawing admiration from even those who had once feared her. The cabin had grown into a proper house with additions built to accommodate their expanding life. They celebrated Elena's birthday with a small party attended by the friends they had made over the past 2 years. Mrs. Patterson brought a cake she had baked herself. Sarah organized games for Elena to play. Wilson told stories about his time in the Army that made everyone laugh. It was by any measure a happy occasion, a celebration not just of Elena's life, but of everything they had built together. That night, after the guests had gone and Elena was asleep in her bed, Caleb and Kaya sat on the porch and watched the stars. The air was warm, carrying the scent of summer, and the silence was peaceful rather than oppressive. Kaya told Caleb that she never imagined this. Not in her darkest moments, not in her wildest dreams. She had spent her whole life expecting nothing but pain and rejection, and here she was with a husband who loved her, a daughter who adored her, and friends who accepted her for who she was. It seemed impossible. It seemed like a gift she did not deserve. Caleb took her hand and told her she deserved every moment of happiness they had found. She had earned it with her strength, her courage, her refusal to let the world break her. If anyone deserved a good life, it was her. Kaya leaned her head against his shoulder and sighed. She told him she was grateful. For him, for Elena, for every day they had together. She did not know what the future would bring, but she knew that whatever came, she would face it with a full heart. They sat together until the moon rose, two people who had started as strangers and had become everything to each other. The road ahead was uncertain, as all roads are, but they had built something real, something lasting, something worth protecting. And that was more than enough. The years passed with a swiftness that surprised them both. Elena grew from a toddler into a child, from a child into a young girl, each stage bringing new challenges and new joys. She learned to ride before she could properly read, taking to horseback with a natural grace that made Caleb proud and Kaya nervous. She learned to shoot by the time she was 8, her aim as true as her mother's, her patience as steady as her father's. She was a fierce, intelligent, determined child, full of questions and opinions, and a stubborn will that reminded Caleb of both her parents. She demanded to know why the sky was blue, why water was wet, why some people were kind and others were cruel. She argued with adults and held her ground against children twice her size. She was, in short, exactly the kind of person her parents had hoped she would be. The homestead continued to grow and prosper. Caleb expanded his horse operation, building a reputation as one of the finest breeders in the territory. Kaya's craft work became sought after by collectors and merchants throughout Colorado and beyond. They hired hands to help with the work, young men and women who were willing to overlook Kaya's heritage in exchange for fair wages and honest treatment. The town, too, continued to evolve. Henderson died of a stroke in the summer of 1895, and with him went much of the organized opposition to the Stone family. The new generation of settlers, many of whom had grown up knowing Elena as a classmate and friend, felt none of the reflexive hostility that had characterized their parents. The Indian Wars were fading into memory, and with them faded some of the fear that had fueled so much prejudice. By the time Elena was 10, Caleb and Kaya had achieved something they had never dared to hope for: acceptance. Not universal and not unconditional, but real. They were part of the community, now known and respected for their hard work and good character. The woman who had arrived at Caleb's gate as a fugitive was now Mrs. Stone, mother of Elena, maker of beautiful things, pillar of the local economy. It was a transformation that still amazed Kaya. She would sometimes stand on the porch of their expanded home, watching Elena play in the yard, and marvel at the distance she had traveled. From outcast to wife, from fugitive to mother, from hated to accepted. She had crossed a continent and built a life, and though the scars of her past would never fully heal, they no longer defined her. She told Caleb once on their 15th wedding anniversary that she had lived 3 lives. The first as the daughter of a warrior ended when her father died. The second as an outcast and survivor ended when she stumbled through his gate in the middle of a blizzard. The third as his wife and Elena's mother was the only one that felt real. The only one that felt like home. Caleb understood. He had lived multiple lives himself. The life before Eleanor and Thomas Golden with innocence. The life after their deaths gray with grief. And the life since Kaya colored with a complexity of joy and pain and love that he would not trade for anything. They were survivors, both of them. They had been broken by the world and had refused to stay broken. They had found each other across impossible distances and had built something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. Not everyone was so lucky. They knew that, and they were grateful for every day they had. Elena turned 15 in the spring of 1904. No longer a child, but not yet a woman. She had inherited her mother's height and strength, standing nearly 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and capable hands. She had her father's gray eyes and his thoughtful manner, but her spirit was all her own, a fierce independence that sometimes clashed with her parents' authority, but that they secretly admired. She had suitors, of course, young men from town and from neighboring ranches drawn by her beauty and her reputation as a skilled horsewoman. But Elena showed little interest in romance, preferring the company of her horses and her books to the attention of lovesick boys. She had plans, she told her parents. Plans that did not include settling down at 16 like so many other girls her age. Kaya supported her daughter's independence, remembering too well what it felt like to have her future decided by others. Caleb was more protective, worried about the dangers that awaited a young woman in a world that was still not kind to those who were different. But he respected Elena's right to make her own choices, and he did his best to prepare her for whatever challenges lay ahead. The summer of 1902 was the hottest anyone could remember. The streams ran low, the grass turned brown, and the livestock suffered in the relentless heat. Caleb worked from dawn to dusk, keeping the horses watered and fed, and Kaya joined him despite his protest that she should rest. She was 39 years old now, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with the marks of a life hard lived. But she was still strong, still capable, and still the woman who had lifted tree trunks like kindling and fought off attackers with her bare hands. Age had softened her edges but had not diminished her spirit. Still, Caleb noticed things that worried him. She tired more easily than she used to. She sometimes paused in her work to catch her breath, her hand pressed to her chest. When he asked if she was all right, she always said yes, but he could see the lie in her eyes. In September, she collapsed while working in the garden. Caleb heard the sound of her falling and came running, finding her unconscious in the dirt, her face pale and her breathing shallow. He carried her inside and sent Elena for the doctor, his heart pounding with the fear he had not felt since the night he thought he had lost her to Grey Wolf. The doctor came and examined her with grave eyes. He told Caleb that Kaya's heart was failing. The years of brutal hardship before she found him, the beatings she had endured, the wounds that had never fully healed, the relentless physical demands she had placed on her body since childhood, it had all taken a toll that her age could not explain. Some bodies simply wore out faster than others, he said, especially those that had been through what hers had been through. There was nothing to be done except keep her comfortable and pray for more time. Caleb refused to accept it. He demanded other opinions, other treatments, other options. But the answers were always the same. Kaya was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The months that followed were the hardest of Caleb's life, harder even than losing Eleanor and Thomas. He watched the woman he loved fade before his eyes, her strength ebbing with each passing day. She tried to hide her decline, still insisting on doing her share of the work, still refusing to give in to the weakness that was consuming her. But he could see the truth, and it broke his heart. They talked about death during those months, something they had never done before. Kaya told him that she was not afraid. She had come close to death so many times that it had lost its power to frighten her. What she feared was leaving him, leaving Elena, leaving the life they had built together. She did not want to go, but she knew that some battles could not be won no matter how hard you fought. She made Caleb promise things. To take care of Elena, to keep the homestead running, to find joy again after she was gone, even if it seemed impossible. She did not want him to mourn forever. She wanted him to live to love, to embrace whatever time he had left. Caleb promised, though the words felt like knives in his throat. He would do what she asked. He would honor her memory by living well. But a part of him knew that the world would never be the same without her in it. The end came on a winter night, 3 months after her collapse. The snow was falling softly outside, covering the world in white, and the fire was burning low in the hearth. Kaya lay in their bed, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. Caleb sat beside her, holding her hand, telling her how much he loved her. Elena sat on her other side, tears streaming down her face, whispering words that Caleb could not hear. The room was quiet except for the crack of the fire and the sound of their breathing, 3 lives that had become one now preparing to separate. Kaya turned her head to look at Caleb, and her eyes were clear despite the drugs the doctor had given her for the pain. She told him that he had given her everything she ever wanted: a home, a family, a love that had survived everything the world could throw at it. She was grateful for every moment they had shared. Caleb told her he was not ready. He could not let her go. She squeezed his hand with the last of her strength. She told him that he was strong enough to survive this. He had survived loss before, and he would survive it again. Not because he had to, but because there was still work to be done, still people who needed him, still life to be lived. She told him to remember her, but not to mourn forever. She wanted him to find joy again, to laugh again, to love again, if his heart led him there. She would be waiting for him on the other side whenever that time came. But until then, she wanted him to live. Her eyes moved to Elena, and her voice grew softer. She told her daughter that she was proud of her, so proud of the woman she was becoming. She told her to be strong, to be brave, to never let anyone make her feel less than she was. She told her to take care of her father, who would need her in the days to come. Elena promised, her voice choked with sobs. She told her mother she loved her, that she would never forget her, that she would carry her memory in her heart forever. Kaya smiled, and for a moment she looked like the woman Caleb had fallen in love with all those years ago, strong and beautiful and full of life. Then she closed her eyes and her breathing slowed, and with one final sigh, she was gone. Caleb stayed by her side for a long time after holding her hand, unwilling to accept that she was truly gone. Elena wept beside him, her sobs the only sound in the silent room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, as if nature itself was mourning the loss of a remarkable woman. They buried her beneath the old pine tree in the clearing, where they had spoken their vows so many years ago. It was a simple ceremony attended by the friends they had made over 15 years of marriage. Mrs. Patterson was there, and Sarah and Wilson, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by Kaya's presence. Caleb stood at the graveside long after the others had gone, staring at the fresh earth and feeling the full weight of his loss. He had buried a wife before, and a son. He had thought he knew what grief felt like. But this was different. Kaya had been more than a wife. She had been his partner, his companion, the other half of his soul. Without her, the world felt empty in ways he could not describe. Elena found him there, as darkness fell, still standing at the grave. She took his arm and led him back to the house, taking care of him the way Kaya had asked. In the days that followed, she was his anchor, the one thing that kept him from drowning in sorrow. She cooked for him, cleaned for him, sat with him through the long nights when sleep would not come. She was her mother's daughter, strong and capable, and full of love. Time passed, as it always does, and the sharp edge of grief dulled into something softer. Caleb went through the motions of living, caring for the horses, maintaining the property, existing in a world that seemed suddenly colorless. But slowly, as winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, he began to find his way back. He started telling stories about Kaya to anyone who would listen, preserving her memory through words and remembrance. He took long rides through the mountains they had explored together, speaking to her spirit as if she could still hear him. And gradually the pain transformed into something different, a bittersweet ache that was still painful but no longer unbearable, a presence rather than an absence, a part of him that would always belong to her. Elena grew into a remarkable young woman, inheriting her mother's strength and her father's wisdom. She took over much of the work on the homestead, freeing Caleb to slow down as age began to claim its due. At 22, she married a young rancher named James Caldwell, a good man who loved her for exactly who she was. Caleb walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, wishing Kaya could have been there to see it. Grandchildren followed, 3 of them in quick succession. Michael, the eldest, had his grandmother's dark hair and fierce spirit. Sarah, the middle child, was quiet and thoughtful like her grandfather. And little Thomas, named for the uncle he would never know, was a whirlwind of energy who kept everyone on their toes. Caleb taught them to ride and hunt and survive in the wilderness, passing on the skills that had kept him alive through decades of hardship. He told them stories about their grandmother, about the night she appeared at his gate in the middle of a blizzard, about the battles they had fought together, about the love that had sustained them through everything. The children loved these stories, begging for more details, asking questions that Caleb was happy to answer. Through their eyes, he saw Kaya again, alive and vibrant, the woman he had loved with all his heart. She was not truly gone, as long as her memory lived on in those who came after. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and milestones, and the quiet accumulation of ordinary joys. Caleb's hair went white, and his body grew frail, but his mind remained sharp and his spirit unbroken. He spent his final years surrounded by family, content in the knowledge that his life had meant something, that the legacy he and Kaya had built together would continue long after he was gone. On a winter night in 1920, when Caleb was 83 years old, he sat on the porch of the house he had built with Kaya and watched the snow fall. It was a gentle snow, soft and silent, the kind that turned the world into a wonderland of white. He thought about the night she had arrived, the night that had changed everything, and he smiled. Elena found him there in the morning, still sitting in his chair, his eyes closed, and a peaceful expression on his face. He had died sometime in the night, slipping away quietly, going to join the woman he had loved and lost and never stopped missing. They buried him beside Kaya, beneath the pine tree that had witnessed their vows and their joy and their sorrow. The stone marker bore both their names now side by side as they had been in life. Caleb Stone and Kaya Blackwater, stoned together forever beneath the Colorado sky. Elena stood at the graveside with her husband and children, tears streaming down her face but her spine straight with the strength her mother had taught her. She told the children that their grandparents had lived remarkable lives. They had survived tragedy and found each other against all odds. They had built a family and a home and a legacy that would endure for generations. They had loved each other with a passion that death itself could not diminish. The children listened with wide eyes, too young to fully understand, but old enough to sense that something important was being shared. They would remember this day, Elena knew. They would carry the stories forward, telling them to their own children and grandchildren, keeping alive the memory of 2 people who had refused to let the world break them. As the mourners dispersed and the afternoon light faded into evening, Elena lingered at the grave. She placed her hand on the cold stone and closed her eyes, remembering the woman who had raised her and the man who had loved her. She whispered a promise to them both. She would live well, she would love fiercely, she would build something beautiful with the life they had given her. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and snow, and for just a moment Elena could have sworn she heard her mother's voice singing an Apache lullaby that she remembered from her childhood. The sound faded as quickly as it had come, but it left behind a warmth that filled her heart. She turned and walked back to her family, to the life that waited for her, to the future that stretched out before her, full of possibility. Behind her, the stone marker stood silent sentinel over two souls who had found each other in the middle of a storm and had never let go. Their story was over, but their legacy lived on. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for.